What if addiction isn't a failure, but a message? What if the very thing that feels like destruction is actually the doorway God uses when someone refuses to listen any other way? What if the craving, the collapse, the chaos, all of it, is a coded signal meant to wake the soul up to a truth it's been avoiding? Because something extraordinary happens the moment this is seen for what it really is. Hold this line. What comes next flips everything you've ever believed about addiction. A strange clarity rises the moment addiction is seen not as weakness but as a soul reaching in the wrong direction. Something inside tries to touch what feels bigger than ordinary life, even if the attempt collapses. The impulse isn't evil, it's misaimed holiness trying to find a doorway. What if the ache itself is guidance towards something deeper? Scenes from everyday life reveal this pattern: the late-night craving, the frantic search, the cycle that feels impossible to break. Beneath those moments sits a hunger too vast for quick fixes, echoing like a spiritual alarm. The behavior looks chaotic, yet the longing underneath is precise. Isn't it curious how the desire points upward even when the action pulls downward? A softer understanding appears when the suffering is viewed as communication rather than punishment. The more intense the struggle, the louder the message that the chosen path isn't meeting the soul's request. A brief pause helps, slow breath in, slow breath out, to feel what the craving is really asking for. Could this discomfort be showing a direction instead of a defect? What once looked like collapse now starts to resemble initiation, the beginning of a deeper calling. Addiction becomes the distorted expression of a spiritual vocation waiting for a cleaner channel. The pain becomes a compass, not a curse, pointing toward the next revelation. And if this is true, what else has been misunderstood in the story of addiction? Modern culture often reacts to addiction as if a person were a malfunctioning device that needs replacement parts. Labels pile up, diagnoses multiply, and the deeper story disappears behind clinical language. The crisis is treated like broken wiring instead of a broken meaning. Doesn't this reduction drain the humanity out of the struggle? Daily examples reflect this misunderstanding. A teenager numbing loneliness is called non-compliant, or an adult escaping emptiness is told they're simply chemically dependent. The deeper dimension, the revolt of the soul, goes unseen. Something inside refuses to live a life that feels too small or too numb. Can mechanical logic ever explain that? A quiet shift occurs when the crisis is viewed through a wider lens. The addictive act becomes a protest against a reality stripped of depth, beauty, and genuine connection. Behind the chaos sits a refusal to settle for a life that feels spiritually airless. If the soul is rebelling, isn't that rebellion telling us something important? What appears as self-destruction may actually be an attempt to break the confines of a life that no longer fits. The world calls it dysfunction, yet the inner impulse points toward truth, freedom, and expansion. This misunderstanding fuels shame, making healing feel unreachable. And if society misreads this so completely, what else lies beneath the surface hunch? Something profound emerges when the addictive pull is recognized as a longing for depth rather than a chase for intoxication. The soul remembers a vastness the mind can't articulate, and the craving becomes its signal flare. Substances temporarily lower the ego's guard, giving a counterfeit taste of unity. Isn't it striking how the desire aims higher than the method? Real-life moments make this clear. The person who drinks to quiet inner noise isn't chasing alcohol but silence. The one who uses stimulants isn't seeking speed but aliveness. Each choice is an attempt to feel whole, even for seconds. The impulse is sacred, yet the strategy backfires. What happens when the method fights the very longing that created it? A moment of reflection shows that the tragedy isn't the hunger but the tool chosen to satisfy it. The longing itself is ancient, spiritual, and accurate, a compass pointing toward union with something greater. Substances act like false prophets, offering glimpses they can't sustain. If the hunger is holy, what could happen if it were directed differently? The inner ache becomes easier to understand when framed as a return home rather than a moral flaw. The person isn't searching for escape but for themselves, for peace, for the dissolving of separation. This realization shifts the entire narrative of healing. And if the longing is sacred, what deeper truth is it calling the person to explore? Next, quiet recognition dawns when the addictive pull is seen as homesickness rather than dependency. The longing reaches toward something remembered but not fully accessible, like a dream fading on waking. This hunger isn't for a substance, it's for belonging, unity, and inner rest. What if the craving is actually a memory calling the person back? Everyday patterns reflect this truth. People chase distractions, relationships, or routines hoping to silence the ache. Yet the emptiness persists, signaling that the real need isn't being met. Willpower becomes a bandage over a wound that isn't physical. Isn't it revealing how discipline fails when the heart feels disconnected? A deeper insight appears when the psychological explanations fall short. The craving points toward a forgotten wholeness, an inner truth obscured by stress, fear, and societal expectations. No chemical can satisfy this ancient call, because it isn't chemical in nature. If the soul is calling home, what would listening actually look like? The addiction cycle becomes clearer when the behavior is separated from the deeper hunger underneath. The person isn't clinging to the substance, they're clinging to the momentary sense of union it imitates. When this illusion fades, the ache returns, asking for a truer reunion. And if this ache keeps returning, where is it pointing next? If this is hitting close to home, take a second, like the video, subscribe, and stay with me. A different picture forms when addiction is viewed as a dismantling rather than a destruction. The structures that once held identity, roles, status, pride, begin to crumble under the pressure of craving and consequence. This collapse feels brutal, yet it exposes what was never truly solid. Isn't it strange how losing everything can reveal what was real all along? Scenes from life show this clearly. Careers fall apart, relationships shatter, and long-maintained masks crack open. Each loss strips away a layer that wasn't authentic, forcing a confrontation with raw truth. The ego fights this unraveling, but something deeper keeps pushing forward. What emerges when the old self can no longer hold? A shift begins when the collapse is recognized as a clearing, not a curse. The space left behind becomes fertile ground for honesty, humility, and awakening. This destruction follows an ancient pattern. The false must fall so the true can rise. If the breaking is part of the process, what might this make possible? What once felt like punishment starts resembling spiritual house cleaning. The ego dissolves, illusions burn away, and only essence remains. In this exposed state, grace can finally appear where pretenses once stood. And if this dissolution is only the beginning, what transformation is waiting beyond it? A new understanding opens when sensitivity is seen as a gift rather than a flaw. Many who struggle with addiction feel life more intensely, noticing details others overlook. Beauty hits harder, pain cuts deeper, and emotions move like weather across the inner world. Isn't it remarkable how the very trait causing overwhelm is also a doorway to insight? Everyday experiences highlight this intensity. A comment that others forget lingers for hours, a quiet room feels too loud, a simple emotion becomes a storm. Substances enter the picture as tools to soften the edges. People aren't trying to escape life, they're trying to manage the volume. Isn't that a different story than the one usually told? A reframing begins when this heightened perception is recognized as divine wiring. It functions like a high-definition antenna, tuned to frequencies most don't hear. This sensitivity can reveal truth, intuition, and deeper layers of reality. If the system is built for depth, what happens when it's finally honored instead of numbed? A quiet shift follows. The person starts meeting their sensitivity with curiosity rather than fear. Practices like journaling, breathwork, or brief pauses throughout the day help ground the intensity. The goal isn't to mute the signal, but to understand it. And if this signal is meaningful, what larger message might it be sending next? A different layer appears when the root of addiction is traced to the illusion of separateness. The sense of being cut off from life, others, or the sacred becomes unbearable, pushing the person toward anything that briefly dissolves the boundary. Substances mimic unity, offering moments where the walls finally drop. Isn't it telling that the relief comes from feeling connected? Daily moments reveal this pattern. Loneliness disguises itself as busyness, disconnection hides behind routines, and the inner silence feels strangely loud. The craving surges when the separation becomes too sharp to endure. In those moments, the person isn't seeking escape but reunion. If the ache is for connection, why do we treat it as pathology? A deeper truth emerges when this illusion is examined. Separation is a mental construct, not a spiritual reality, yet it feels painfully real. Addictive behavior becomes an attempt to return to the wholeness the mind has forgotten. If chemistry can temporarily imitate unity, what would genuine connection offer instead? A subtle turning begins when awareness notices the real desire underneath the substance. The person wants the boundary to dissolve, the heart to open, and the sense of isolation to end. This longing is not broken, it's accurate. And if the longing is correct, what new understanding does relapse reveal about the self? A softer perspective rises when relapse is seen not as collapse but as information. Each return to the substance highlights the wounds still unaddressed, the emotions still unattended, the spiritual hunger still unfed. Instead of proof of weakness, relapse becomes a mirror. Isn't it striking how honesty grows when judgment stops? Real-life patterns make this visible. After periods of progress, stress spikes, loneliness returns, or old fears resurface, and the pull intensifies. These moments reveal where healing hasn't yet reached. The spiral repeats because the root hasn't been touched. What if the repetition is trying to show the way forward? A turning point emerges when relapse becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. Every slip traces back to something the heart is still avoiding, a conversation left unsaid, a memory unprocessed, a truth buried beneath habit. This feedback is precise, pointing directly to what needs attention. If the signal is clear, what would listening change? A new direction opens when the cycle is no longer seen as linear. Recovery moves like a spiral, circling back to deeper layers of the same lesson. Setbacks aren't derailments, they are part of the curriculum. And if the curriculum is this intentional, what descent prepares the ground for the next hour? Ening? If this is hitting close to home, take a second, like the video, subscribe, and stay with me. The truth grows sharper when the darkness of addiction is faced without sugarcoating. Shame builds, trust breaks, and the world shrinks into a private battlefield. This descent feels like being swallowed by the very shadow one tried to outrun. Isn't it revealing how the lowest point often exposes the deepest truth? Everyday scenes carry this weight, hiding bottles, lying to loved ones, waking up lost in another broken promise. The pain becomes a wilderness where everything familiar disappears. Nothing feels stable, yet something essential begins to surface in the emptiness. What emerges when comfort is no longer an option? A deeper understanding appears when this suffering is seen as the mythic descent found in every spiritual tradition. Transformation rarely arrives wrapped in ease, it demands confrontation with inner darkness. The fire burns away illusions, making room for clarity. If this descent is part of the path, what is it preparing? A subtle shift becomes possible when the person stops judging the depth of their fall. The darkness becomes a crucible, not a grave. Within it, identity melts, truth sharpens, and the spiritual foundation begins to rebuild. And if descent is only the first half of the journey, what does the rise require? A different light shines on addiction when craving is examined instead of resisted. The moment the inner war pauses, something honest emerges beneath the surface impulse. The craving wasn't for the substance at all, it was for peace, unity, and silence. Isn't it surprising how the truth reveals itself when the fight stops? Everyday experiences show this clearly. The tension before using comes from fear, not desire. The relief afterward comes from stillness, not intoxication. When the person looks directly at the urge, the illusion breaks. What they wanted was freedom from separation. If the craving points upward, why chase it downward? A quiet opening forms when surrender is understood correctly. It isn't giving up, it's giving into clarity. When the person stops battling the craving and instead observes it, the need dissolves into truth. What changes when acceptance replaces resistance? A new identity begins forming in the space where the struggle once lived. Seeing the craving's nature exposes the spiritual longing at its core. The war ends not with victory but with recognition. And if this is the moment the illusion cracks, what transformation waits on the other side? A profound shift begins when the journey through addiction is seen as initiation rather than shame. Those who survive its depths carry an understanding of suffering that can't be learned from books or theories. Their scars hold maps, their stories carry medicine. Isn't it powerful how pain becomes qualification? Real-life moments reveal this transformation. Someone who once hid their struggle now recognizes it in others with uncanny accuracy. They hear the tremor behind the words, see the fear behind the mask, feel the loneliness behind the smile. Compassion deepens because they've walked the same inner terrain. What kind of wisdom grows from that? A new purpose emerges when the inner landscape has been burned clean. The healed addict becomes an anchor for those still drowning, offering presence rather than perfection. Their past becomes a lantern, illuminating paths others can't yet see. If pain becomes light, what doors can it open? The spiritual arc becomes undeniable. Descent leads to depth, depth leads to clarity, clarity leads to service. What once looked like ruin becomes initiation into empathy, discernment, and grounded strength. The wounded become the healers, the lost become the guides. And if this journey ends in service, what calling rises next? When the entire journey is seen through this wider lens, addiction stops looking like a punishment and starts revealing itself as a turning point. The descent, the craving, the collapse, every phase becomes part of the awakening that was trying to happen all along. And once this truth clicks, the next step becomes unmistakably clear. Life is inviting a different kind of honesty now, a different kind of courage. So pause for a moment. Breathe once. Notice what rises. If this message stirred something in you, let it continue. Subscribe so the next teaching reaches you the moment it arrives, and tap the bell to stay connected. Share this with someone who needs a new way of seeing their own struggle. What part of your story is asking to be rewritten? And what truth have you been avoiding that's finally ready to be heard? The next video on your screen continues this path. Follow it. It might be exactly where your awakening begins.